As a preacher, sometimes I'll get the question, is Jesus God? Was it easier for him to resist temptation? Does it lessen the meaning of Jesus being tempted in all points, just as we are, yet without sin? Was it easier for Jesus than it is for us to always make the choice to do the right thing because he was God? You might be surprised to learn that before he was born as Jesus, he was God. But then he gave up being God when he chose to be born as a human being known as Jesus. Let's look at some Bible passages that show that before he was born in the flesh and given the name Jesus, he was in fact God. And we'll see some passages that show that when he became flesh and blood, he gave up his deity to be just like you and me, with the same weaknesses, the same struggles, and the same challenges that you and I have today. Now, before we turn to these passages, there's something that we need to understand. When I say that Jesus was God, what that means is that Jesus was deity. Deity describes someone who has four characteristics. They are omnipresent, they're everywhere at once. They're omniscient, they have all knowledge. They're omnipotent, they have all power, and they're eternal. And it's these four characteristics that describe and characterize deity. Before Jesus was born in the flesh, that's what he was. He was omnipotent, he was omniscient, he was eternal, and he was omnipresent. It's also important to remember that there are actually three deistic beings. There is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And these three individual beings are all deistic, with the same attributes that make them deistic. The Father is not Jesus. The Holy Spirit isn't the Father. Jesus isn't the Holy Spirit. All three of them are distinct individual entities. Now let's think about Jesus before he became flesh and blood. Who was Jesus before he was born as Jesus? When you go all the way back to the very beginning of time, you will find that God created the heavens and the earth, and he did so in 6 days. On the 6th day is when he created humanity, the first man and woman named Adam and Eve. Notice what it says in Genesis 1, verse 26. It says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.'" Did you notice the pronouns that were used in that verse? God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." Question: who is God talking to? God was talking to someone. It wasn't the first human because Adam and Eve had not yet been created. So who is God talking to when he said, "Let us make man in our image"? I can turn to the New Testament book of John and find the answer. Listen to how the Gospel of John begins. John chapter 1 verses 1 to 3 tells us that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. This passage identifies someone called the Word. And there are 4 things that this passage says about the Word. First, it says that the Word was in the beginning. So I go all the way back to Genesis 1 and I read about the creation of all things, and the Word was there. Second, this passage tells me that the Word was with God. Third, this passage tells me that the Word was God. The Word was with God, the Father, and the Word had all the characteristics that made him God, deity. Fourth, it says that the Word was involved in the process of creation. creation, that all things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. So here is this word. And the word was in the beginning, the word was God, the word was with God. So I take that back to Genesis chapter 1, and in verse 26, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. And who was God talking to? He was talking to the Word that was with God, and the Word that was himself deity. But who is the Word? I keep reading John chapter 1, and I come down to verse 14, and the Word is identified. There it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. This passage says that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and he is identified as the only begotten of the Father. Let's put that another way. He was the Son of God. That's Jesus. Before he was born in the flesh and given the name Jesus, he was known as the Word and as one that was God, deity. Now, who was Jesus after he was born in the flesh and given the name Jesus? Was he still deity? Was he still known as God? To answer that question, let's just look at two Bible verses. First, let's read Hebrews chapter 2. This is a passage that explains to us that God made his Son flesh and blood, and then tells us why he did it. In fact, there are two specific reasons. First, the Word became human and was given the name Jesus so that he could die. Watch what it says in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil. Just as you and I are flesh and blood, Jesus became flesh and blood, and he became flesh and blood so that he could die, and through his death destroy the one who had the power of death, and that is identified as the devil. In essence, this passage says that Jesus became flesh and blood so that he could die, and thus defeat the devil and save us. Second, he became flesh and blood so that he could understand us. Skip down to verse 17. Hebrews 2 verse 17 tells us this. Therefore he had to be made like his brethren in every respect. Don't miss the fact that he said that he was made like us in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of his people. He had to be made like his brothers. In other words, he had to be made human just like you and I are human in every way. Jesus became human just as much as you and I are human. So before he was born as Jesus, he was known as the Word. He was God. He was with God, that is, with the Father. But at some point in time, God infused Jesus into a physical body, placed him into the womb of the Virgin Mary. He was born and he was given the name Jesus. Why? Verse 17 tells us, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. Jesus became flesh and blood so that he could understand the challenges and difficulties that you and I face, and that because he wants to be a merciful high priest. Now, some people might say, well, now wait a minute. Jesus was tempted 3 times by the devil in Matthew chapter 4. But those temptations were not hard to resist, because after all, he was deity. He was God's Son. And when Jesus suffered and died on the cross, that wasn't hard for him to endure, because after all, he was deity. He was the Son of God. But that's not true. Jesus gave up his deity when he became flesh and blood. And he did so that he could understand how difficult it was to live as a human being. With all the weaknesses, with all the frustrations, with all the struggles, he wanted to understand that. And to understand that, he had to give up his deity. So I take that over to Matthew chapter 4, and I read about the temptations of Jesus. When the devil tempted him to turn stones into bread, was that hard for him to resist? Did Jesus desire to do that? Yes. It would not have been temptation if it wasn't. When the devil said, bow down and worship me, did Jesus want to do that? Yes. It would not have been temptation if he didn't have the desire. Jesus was flesh and blood, human being, just as you and I. And he had the same temptations and desires that you you and I have today. That's what makes him capable of sympathizing with us. And so when you struggle with temptation, he understands how hard that is because he's been there. When you struggle with your emotions, he understands what that's like because he's been there. He struggled with his own emotions. When you have a hard time holding your tongue when someone wrongs you, Jesus understands that because he's been in that situation. We do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was tempted in all points just as we are, yet without sin. Now, did Jesus lose his deity forever when he gave up his deity to live as a flesh and blood human being? After Jesus was crucified, 3 days later, he was raised from the dead. He spent about 40 days with his disciples, then he ascended back up into heaven to be with the Father. I can read about that in Acts chapter 1, verses 9 to 11. When Jesus ascended back into heaven, did he regain his deity? Yes, he did. Right now, Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God, existing as deity, as God is deity. But here's what I find so interesting, so comforting. Though he is in heaven as deity, sitting at the right hand of God, Jesus still remembers what it's like to be a human being. Over and over again, the Bible tells us that Jesus is at the right hand of God for us. For example, in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 24, it talks about Jesus being at the right hand of God, and it says, "For Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us." Jesus is in the presence of God, and he's there for us. What is Jesus doing for us? He's serving as our advocate, that is, our defense attorney. For example, I can read in 1 John chapter 2, verse 1. He says, "My little children, these things I write to you so that you may not sin. And if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous." The book of 1 John was written with the specific purpose of helping us not sin. We are to do our absolute best to not violate the laws of God, and the book of 1 John was designed to help us do that. But even if we do, John writes that we have an advocate with the Father, and that advocate, that defense attorney, is identified as Jesus Christ the righteous. When you sin, we have someone that represents us. Someone who is on our side, someone who will go to bat for us. And that because he lived as a human being and he knows how hard it is to resist temptation. He knows how hard it is when we struggle with our emotions. And with him living as a human being, it makes him the perfect advocate for us. So when you and I make a mistake, Jesus is sitting right next to God, and it's as if he turns to God and he says, "I understand what that's like. I know how hard that is. I know what it's like to struggle like that." This man's showing remorse. This person is showing a heart of contrition. Let's go easy on him. And God says, okay. He's forgiven. Before he was born and given the name Jesus, he existed as deity known as the Word. But at some point in time, the Word gave up his deity, was born in the flesh, and was given the name Jesus. He lived as a man, a human being, and now he sits at the right hand of God as one who understands what we go through. And so he is our high priest, our advocate, our defense attorney that represents us to God.